Hello and welcome to Just One Q, the podcast where we explore the latest ideas in workplace belonging in conversation with thought leaders and experts. Each episode, a guest and I dive into a question that highlights their area of expertise, and the goal is to leave you with tools and insights that you can use to make your workplace better and more human-friendly. I'm your host, Dominique. I'm an inclusion educator and advocate working for Dialectic, an inclusive workplace learning consultancy in lovely Guelph, Ontario, which is situated on the treaty lands and territories of the Mississaugas of the Credit First Nation and the traditional lands of the Chinoochton and Haudenosaunee peoples. Joining me today is Dr. Ludmila Praslova, the author of The Canary Code, a guide to neurodiversity, dignity, and intersectional belonging at work from Barrett Kohler Publishers, and a member of the Thinkers 50 Radar class of 2024, which is a global group of management thinkers most likely to make an impact on the world. Dr. Praslova is a professor of graduate industrial organizational psychology at Vanguard University in Southern California, and she is an inclusive talent strategy expert with extensive experience in global diversity and neurodiversity. Her consulting is focused on creating organizational systems for inclusion and well-being and providing neuroinclusion training and support to organizations such as Amazon, Bank of America, and MIT. Welcome to the show, Ludmila.
Thank you. I'm thrilled to be here.
I am so excited to have you on today and to get to have this conversation with you because I read your book cover to cover, devoured it, and there's just such richness and depth covered in your book. And I'm hoping that our conversation today can just sort of pick up some of those themes and share them with our listeners to make them excited about this and also excited to pick up your book and to learn more and apply some of the lessons.
Well, thank you.
So the question that we're going to be sort of framing our conversation with today is how can neuroinclusion transform leadership and workplace culture? And before we dive into that, I want to kind of start with a bit of grounding. Neurodivergence is a term that many people hadn't heard about 10 years ago, and now people commonly identify as neurodivergent very openly in the workplace. So I'd like to know, how do you define neurodivergence, and what is it about it that you wish more people understood, about what it is and what it isn't?
I'm a very stickler academic in that regard, in that if someone defined a term, I try to define it the way they did and not mess it with it too much. Then if I need something different, then I should invent my own term. So I try not to redefine other people's terminology, which is something that not everyone does. So I think to really understand things like neurodivergence, neurodiversity, there's another key term is neuronormativity, which is a cultural idea that there is one way to be a human that's right, and then things that don't fall within that are somehow wrong, not normal. And if you look through the history, and I happen to be history buff, we have not had the same idea of what that particular normal is. Because if you look at ancient Egypt, medieval Japan, and modern Canada, we would have sort of different ideas of the intensity of emotional expression that's allowed and how you should be, seen by others and present yourself. So it's not a constant that's just kind of written in a human brain and, in your DNA structure. A lot of it is cultural. And very often people kind of forget about it and they just say, well, your brain is wrong and your brain is right. But actually, we do have differences in our brain wiring, but whether or not they are considered desirable, undesirable, or neutral, some of that is actually quite cultural. So there might be some, completely distressing things that most people will define as, it's a problem when someone is intensely suffering, let's say. But otherwise, there are many behaviors that could be considered desirable or undesirable depending on geography and the time period. And so if we're talking specifically how people came up with the whole idea of neurodiversity, that comes out of autistic community in 1990s when people started talking about pathologizing of autistic characteristics, and they started asking, why is it wrong to be really, really interested in something? Why is it wrong to want to have some predictability in your life? How are those things dysfunctional? And so that idea grew into the idea of neurodiversity, and we're not wrong, and we're not broken, we're just different. And there needs to be just more expanded definition of what is, human functioning, because neurodiversity is a feature of humanity. But because we have this idea of neuronormativity, then some people kind of fall on the margin or off the margin. And so then we refer to those people as neurodivergent. And the original idea of the term neurodivergent was very broad. It was never meant to just refer to, autistic, ADHD, dyslexia. That's why we also invented the term neurominority to refer to those more developmental, innate, and often marginalized differences. But the word neurodivergence was meant to be very broad and include things like Parkinson's, or now we're talking about long COVID. You have brain fog that many people would consider neurodivergence, and just something that is significantly different from what's considered average or normal or typical within the society. So neurodivergence is a very broad term of how you may not fit into the narrow definition.
Well, that's such a helpful thing just to start off with, because I do think that we do have a tendency when we hear neurodivergent to think autism first, maybe ADHD second. And this idea of it being a broader concept and a broader construct is important so that we can approach different people with the same kind of compassion and empathy and access and all of the things that we would extend to somebody who has one difference. We can do the same for a broader category of experiences and personality differences. So I like that very much. I also love the reminder that it's culturally defined, because I think a part of this and why we're seeing many, many people identify with neurodivergence could just be the narrowing of our culture and what's acceptable, what is considered normal. Like the road is very narrow these days. So it's just, no wonder we have this cultural wave of acceptance and identification with neurodivergence. It makes a lot of sense when you frame it with that.
Thank you. Absolutely.
Yeah. So in your book, which I can't say enough about it, and I'll be talking about it for the next hour through our recording, The Canary Code, A Guide to Neurodiversity, Dignity, and Intersectional Belonging at Work, you tell readers a bit about your own story and your experience and how it shaped your understanding of workplace inclusion. So I'd love to know, if your younger self walked into today's workplaces, what would surprise them? What would be surprising? And what would still feel sort of frustratingly familiar?
Well, I started working at 14 at a factory. So I may sound like I'm ancient in some ways because I remember things, like factories probably still look like, but I still remember typewriters in offices and so forth. And in some ways, it's actually worse. And because at least where I was specific, we did not have open offices. It was private or maybe like 5-6 people office maximum. So, and I include like going as a child to my mother's office jobs in different places. And I don't remember seeing an open office. And they might have existed somewhere, but I don't think that was a positive development necessarily.
I would have to agree with you on that. The
I don't
cubicle
know that
farm.
existed, but yeah.
Yeah, the cubicle farm is not a positive development in office layouts, that's for sure.
So I'm not entirely sure why people decided that we'll do it for aesthetic purposes, but it's really not conducive to any kind of thinking for most people, not even just for neurodivergent people, and then for autistic people, it's just an absolute nightmare. So I'm not entirely sure about that one. And another thing, so there were some good things about typewriters and handwriting because it forces you to think logically and you can't be sloppy. Because sloppiness doesn't work. So in this particular case, you could say maybe we got a little bit sloppier in our thinking, but in that particular case, I would take my laptop over typewriter any day because laptops gave people freedom. And I remember getting that freedom in the 1990s. And so I do mention it in my book too. And unfortunately, we haven't put it to good use. And until the pandemic, people still insisted that, no, it's not possible to have people out offices, even though, have laptop will travel had existed for almost 3 decades by that time, and now for more than 3 decades. And then the push back to offices and taking away the flexibility, even though people have proven they can work flexibly, is also something that's quite puzzling to me in its logic. I mean, I can understand that some people frame it as culture, but most people are not buying it. It just seems to be much more about control and long-term preferences rather anything that's actually substantiated.
Yeah.
And if you look at research, it's just there's no good reason to bring people to the office, especially if it doesn't work with your productivity pattern.
Of course. And it's, there have been many studies about showcasing, who you lose when you do those big back to office pushes. And of course, people who are neurodivergent are going to be one of those groups. I can speak for myself. I have, kids. My son is autistic. It does present some challenges in terms of being a working parent. I'm also a single parent. So if I lose flexibility, you'll lose me. That's how that math will go, right? And so I have to agree with you there. I think it's that pushback to the office is something that's very contentious, and it is often done in the name of culture. And then you have to ask, like, whose culture, right?
Exactly.
So yeah. Well, it's so interesting to hear about those differences across the decades and how in some ways there's seemingly like some progress with technology and things like that, but we've also not really broken through and created systems that work for people, even though we probably have a bigger awareness now of differences and needs for accommodation and things like that.
But human-centric workplace is still not here, unfortunately.
No. That's something that, we push on thematically in this podcast through a whole bunch of different avenues. And it's, the gaps are definitely glaring enough that I can have a podcast about it. So that's the goal for today too, is just sort of try to see what those actions are that we can take. And as leaders, especially, like, how do we get started and how do we make neuroinclusion part of how we are designing our workplaces? So I want to move into that a little bit. So for leaders to really engage with that work of inclusion, you argue in your book that they have to find their why first. And the why I would say that we're probably most familiar with is the business case for inclusion. And this is, I come across articles constantly that drive me crazy that talk about autism and innovation, or autism and data processing superpowers. This idea that you should hire autistic or other neurodivergent people because they're going to have a different skill set necessarily. And I'm wondering, what is the danger of chasing the business case alone? And could you share maybe an example of where the wrong why led to poor decisions for neurodivergent employees?
So many reasons. Definitely not a huge fan of this sort of business case. Just hire autistic people because they're good with data, or hire, dyslexic people because they're creative. all those things are nothing but stereotypes. And occupational typecasting is very problematic because, again, we're humans who have a variety of abilities, even not just because all those things overlap, and someone could have every check mark within the set of typical neurodivergent differences. So you could be autistic and ADHD and dyslexic and a couple of other things. And so how are we supposed to hire you based on one of those? Are you creative or good with data, or what is it? Just people have their own individual patterns. We all have our own strengths and weaknesses. And statistically, you could say that, yes, so autistic people do outperform the average population on, let's say, identifying hidden information in the patterns. And okay, fine. It's statistics. It doesn't apply to every individual. So every individual still has their own pattern. And there's all kinds of things. So some people, it's not a nice term, but I did not invent it, but they talk about autistic ghettos, where you just basically stick all the autistic people and make them work on data things, and you don't even allow them to communicate with anyone else because they're still considered as kind of inferior generally, but they're just good at one thing. So we'll just put them there and have them work on this thing. Obviously, horrible concept. So, okay, so those people at least got jobs. But if you don't fit this particular stereotype, you don't get jobs at all, because all the hiring is concentrated in tech, and people would be saying that those are specific roles that are available for autistic people. And if you're autistic and creative, too bad, because we don't have anything that's available. So that's why I'm saying just let's make entire organizations and all roles inclusive, not try to designate those specific roles. But then there's an even harder thing that happens there, and more problematic thing, in that people look at those statistics and say, okay, so autistic people are 140% more productive than other people. Yay. So we are going to expect you to do the work of 2 or 3 people. And there is actually a pressure to say, okay, we hired you and nobody else would hire autistic people. So now you do produce the work of 2 or 3 people. And that's definitely not what we mean by inclusion. And there's also sometimes, okay, so nobody is in that particular area. And several years ago, it was tech people couldn't hire for tech positions, and they say, okay, so autistic people to the rescue, because nobody wants to do those jobs and we can't find anyone and nobody can do those jobs.
Like plugging the hole.
Plugging the hole, the last resort. And more recently, it was like, okay, give us people with Down syndrome because nobody wants to clean the hotels. Like, okay, how about you just think about them as humans rather than, again, plugging the hole. So all of those mindsets really come from this extreme business case where we completely disengage ethically from human, and we just think about them as an instrument to achieve blah. And if there's another instrument that achieves blah, then who cares about them?
Yeah. So how do we shift from that business case mindset to a mindset that actually will produce inclusive results as leaders?
Well, there are more and more people who understand the importance of moral case and just doing the right thing. But even if someone is not quite ready and just too married to the business case, you don't have to have an extractive business case. There could be a business case for creating better workplace environments where everyone can achieve the results. So if, let's say, you bring people with all kinds of abilities and match them to roles where they are going to be exercising their top abilities and not just, I just want to plug a hole again, just need a warm body somewhere, but you actually think about the best fit and the best alignment and job crafting, and then you match people according to their abilities and the spikes of neurodivergent profiles, but then also whatever abilities neurotypical people have, just creating better matching of roles for everyone,
Yeah.
you are going to end up with much higher productivity because you're just going to have people working in their actual areas of strength rather than those imagined stereotypical areas of strengths. So we could create the case for what I call inclusive thriving, which is both ethical, but we also are saying, you know what, if we're treating people ethically and allowing them to work in their zone of thriving, that does translate into organizational thriving through productivity.
I love that. It's people are running a business. There has to be a business case for a lot of decisions. And when you're, sitting in a boardroom and talking about your approach, it has to be present. And so what you're giving us is sort of this other way of thinking about it that is a marriage of ethical and business. And you don't have to have one or the other. It doesn't have to be like 100%, we're just doing this because it's the right thing. Doing the right thing also will have some benefits to the business as well.
Being pragmatic doesn't have to mean being inhumane. And I think those
Right.
things have been confused a lot.
Yeah, absolutely. In your book, something else that you describe in terms of leadership is you frame it as kind of diversity work by default. And you talk about it as explaining that cultural humility should inform the way that leaders respond to neurodivergence on their teams. So can you just explain why is cultural humility a useful lens for leaders to use when they're thinking about neuroinclusion?
Just because for many of us, it's a little bit more familiar. And Canada obviously has quite a bit of cultural diversity, right? And most societies now are multicultural enough for people to have an idea that, different kinds of foods and different kinds of music are a good thing, right? You kind of get bored if you only get one type of food in your town for most people.
Yeah, I don't want to eat
So,
haggis and hear bagpipes forever. There's got to be more.
okay. So that's what you have, right? And you want a
Yeah.
little bit more variety. And so, I don't, there's nothing bad with that, but yeah, a little bit of variety. And uh, so people would want a little bit, some Spanish food and not all, Scottish food, right? So we can just easier create a parallel to those differences in a non-stigmatizing way. So just like people have different cultural differences, they're kind of coded on the level of their brains and their preferences and their food preferences and what they like. And there are also some differences in how we perceive the world and how we interact with it that are based on our natural wiring, but they're not necessarily, again, bad. And then people who have similar wiring also create the cultural characteristics together. So just like we talk about deaf with a small d, but deaf with a capital D to refer to deaf culture, we can talk in the same way about autistic culture, for example, or ADHD culture. And there definitely are some expressions and ideas and terminology associated with it. And it's just sometimes easier to explain to people through cultural humility that you can also form the same type of humility towards neurodivergence and disability or different levels of ability. I don't like euphemisms with regard to disability, but if you start talking about humility when it comes to neurodivergence and disability, I just find it's a little bit easier to make the cultural humility parallel, but the logic is the same. You just don't assume that you're better than other people, and you listen to them and you learn from them. And the basic idea that difference is a good thing or a neutral thing. It's definitely not something that you just want to stomp out and say, okay, so this style of communication is not acceptable. You usually would not say that in intercultural relations because that's not cool. So why do we assume that we could just say, well, autistic people, you just need to start talking like neurotypical people because their direct communication is not acceptable.
Yeah, that's a
Dutch
great
people are more
example.
direct, and there's
Yeah.
nothing wrong with that.
Yeah, that's a wonderful example. And I think, while we don't have perfect cultural humility, it
Right.
is definitely something that, and we're working on that, right? But that is something that most people, as you're saying, can access a bit more easily as a lens. And I love that example when it comes to language and the cultural preferences that emerge in groups of autistic people, for example. I want to talk about language because it's such an important part of this. And I think it's kind of a stumbling block for people. I'll give an anecdote to start. So, my son is autistic and he attends a wonderful school in Cambridge, Ontario, that's called Oak Bridge Academy. And this school provides specialized education to exceptional learners, including many autistic children. And this past weekend, we were standing in line actually to get accommodations at Canada's Wonderland, which is a big theme park here north of Toronto. And in this lineup, he explained to me that the people at his school use the language of neuroatypicality instead of neurodivergence, and that he prefers this. That was his preference. And I was thinking, man, oh man, like language really shifts quickly because neurodivergence to me is such a friendly term already. And he's like, no, I'm putting that aside. I want it to be neuroatypicality now. And so this is just to say that for many people, using inclusive language around neurodiversity can feel like a challenge or like a moving target. And well-meaning people can say harmful things. It happens all the time. So, unfortunately, the missteps can betray biases or ableist value judgments that are personal or in the broader culture that informs our language. It's not even always a personal opinion. So I just would love to hear you speak to the importance of language as a means for inclusion and maybe give some tips as to how we can meet this challenge when the target might be moving or the ideas may be complex.
There are kind of two issues here. One is just knowing the words that are either current or preferred by specific groups of people. And if you're interacting with someone, just asking for their preference usually takes care of that. But sometimes it could be a moving target. I am aware that there's a group of researchers that were very intentionally were trying to replace neurodiversity with neuroatypicality. And so there was a concerted effort to do that. And whenever people say things like, with autism or symptoms,
Yeah. Yep.
that is a much bigger problem. So when you have, people like be called neurospicy or other individual preference, that's one thing. But when people have been told multiple times, so please don't use with, and they insist on with, and then they tell you, no, you are with autism and I know better. And they insist on using the terms disorders and symptoms instead of differences and characteristics. Now, that could be a larger problem than someone forgetting the word because they didn't grow up with that word.
Sure.
Because that you can just always say, okay, next time I'll just try to remember the word that is desired. But when we continue using the language that is associated with pathology paradigm, that really is a very different issue. And that is an issue of underlying assumptions.
Mm-hmm.
If you are using language of neurodiversity and you're only using it just because you think it's a popular term, so you talk about neurodiversity, but you still say neurodiversity is about disorders like autism and ADHD. Well, that's a dead giveaway that you actually do not understand neurodiversity, because autistic people who invented the term neurodiversity were very specific that diversity, not disorder, not pathology. But if you're just saying neurodiversity as a word without being rooted in that actual concept, that diversity there has been very intentionally as opposed to lesser than, then you're not rooted in it. And if you're not rooted in neurodiversity thinking as diversity, then your entire framing is still within the pathology model. And of course you're going to keep using with and symptoms because your mindset is not rooted in understanding that it truly is diversity and not a deficit.
Mm. Yeah,
Am I
that's such
making
a,
sense?
absolutely. Yeah. What I'm hearing is like mindset first. We have to have the
Yes.
mindset first, and that
It's assumptions.
the language then flows from that. And if you're having trouble using the correct terms, it could be because you haven't taken the time to get grounded in that right mindset of diversity.
Yes.
Yeah, I completely agree, and I really appreciate that answer. It is something that often I think can be almost weaponized as an excuse by people, this idea of the language being so complex or impenetrable or whatever. And it's like, I love your approach is just ask the person, right? A very important thing to remember as a starting point.
This is really for most people in interactions, for most leaders, that's really all they need to do. I do hold researchers to higher standard who are trying to write articles about something and they don't educate themselves on those terms. But for most everyday individuals, that's the one rule. Just ask the person how they would like to be referred to. And if you forget, then just apologize and try again.
Perfect. Yeah. I want to flip this to the other side of communication, which is the listening side.
Mhm.
What can listening look like in neuroinclusive leadership? So let's say a neurodivergent employee brings a concern to their manager. What is something that the manager could do to demonstrate that they're listening well?
Yes, and listening is not a simple process. It's not just, involves your ears. It's actually involves your entire brain and your entire being. It's emotional, it's just being motivated to pay attention to that person and show genuine interest. And yes, people do get spidey sounds and they do know if they're being actually listened to or just, given platitudes. Then it's behavior. Then you're responding with verbal and nonverbal feedback and also take action. It doesn't necessarily mean doing whatever the employee is asking you to do. It may or may not be what you can do, but you can do something. You can look for alternatives if you can't meet the request, but there needs to be some kind of, in many cases, behavioral follow-up when you say, well, if this is a problem, then maybe we can brainstorm decisions and actually do something, whatever is within your control and makes sense. And then just cognitively paying attention, understanding, interpreting things carefully, and also not falling into the trap of interpreting irrelevant information. So very often, people who don't have enough experience with neurodivergences get distracted by eye contact or fidgeting, and then they just kind of discount neurodivergent communication. So being able to understand that lack of eye contact or fidgeting, they're not about you. They're not about disrespecting you. It's just how people are wired. That's how they regulate. And maybe it takes all their gut to say what they need to say to you while looking at their knees, because if they look at something else, they won't have enough mental capacity to communicate. So understanding that there are differences in communication and respecting those differences is one of the crucial points of neuroinclusive listening.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I mean, I come across articles and things all the time about active listening or or just communication tips that are really prioritizing communication that is not neuroinclusive.
Yes.
So like we can read all day about the importance of eye contact and the importance of putting away distractions and sitting still and giving your full attention and all of these cues that you're really listening to the person. And I'm glad you're bringing up this idea that successful communication can look different for different people, and that we have to have a little bit more flexibility in our conception of what that can look like. Not to mention, there are neurodivergent managers who may struggle also to kind of convey those more stereotypical expectations of listening. So I think just having an open mind and looking for those actions rather than focusing on the physical presentation of somebody who's listening is an interesting way to go about it.
Absolutely, just broadening the idea of what is appropriate communication and going away from neuronormativity. And again, it's cultural because it's also different across, global cultures, how you communicate, how you listen, and the amount of eye contact. So if we just say, is it arbitrary?
Mm.
Is it really necessary to quality communication or is it arbitrary? And a lot of things that we demand from people, whether it's camera on, look me in the eye, or don't move, are very, very arbitrary.
Yeah, and they don't, at the end of the day, impact performance.
Exactly.
So, yeah. So, I mean, these expectations start usually even before day one, right? In interviews,
Yeah.
in hiring processes. So let's go back and say that we've just hired a brand new employee who has disclosed some sort of neurodivergence. If you could redesign the typical onboarding process for neurodivergent employees, what are one or two things that you would throw out or dismiss immediately, and what would you replace them with?
And here is one example where we really want to use sometimes more precise language because neurodivergent is very broad. And someone who's autistic might have very different needs than someone who is dyslexic. So the one thing you need to throw out is just this rigid playbook that things can only work in one way. But there are some things that you can throw out that probably will everyone appreciate. Nobody needs those super long orientation days because I think everyone, even the most extroverted neurotypical, is going to be brain dead after the long day of, meeting million people or learning million things. That's just kind of no human can handle that thing. And so get rid of those super long orientation days and distribute it a little bit more across multiple days. And some of it can even go, online, and some of it be in person. Just mix it up across different days so you don't overwhelm someone on day one. And beyond that, really just provide a menu of options with an understanding that there's no one size fits all. Provide a menu of options like how do they want to meet people and how would they like to start, and let them decide ideally. Just have that orientation menu and say, well, this is how I envision, like over 3 days, let's do this and this. And that usually works much better than just having this one thing that's supposed to work for everyone, because we know that it's not just neurodivergence. There are people, who are breastfeeding, who have all kinds of things that prevent them from being on the same schedule as everyone else. So just give people flexibility and don't make a big deal out of it.
Yeah, I like this idea that the key is flexibility and that it benefits everybody. I guess it goes back to the ethos of your book, which is just this idea that if you're, you know, doing things that are healthy and productivity inducing for a certain set of people, it most usually benefits the whole. So I like that approach to, onboarding. And when we think about interviewing, also just having a broader range of options and actually talking to people. I mean, who knew? Just talking to people.
And
Yeah.
asking them what works for them.
Yeah. Yeah. That's amazing. Yeah.
You would think it kind of makes sense, but sometimes we're just not very quick adopting common sense solutions.
Yeah, for sure. I'd love to talk about the physical workplace, which is another area that often comes up when we're talking about access or also accommodations. So I want to ask, how might autistic people experience the sort of typical physical and sensory demands of a workplace? And what are some practical things that can be done to improve access? And I'm asking this of autistics because I want to be a bit more precise with this one, understanding that, of course, different neurodivergence examples are going to have different needs and different experiences of the workplace. And it's also personal. What are some practical things that we can do to make spaces a bit friendlier?
Sure. And even within autistic community, it's even not that straightforward because we typically think about autistic people as sensory avoidant or sensory sensitive, which is the typical. And research does show that autistic people process those stimuli more intensely. And yes, it's not in our head. It actually is too loud and it is too bright. And that is how it's processed. And yet there are also autistic people who are sensory seeking. And they do want things a little bit brighter and louder. And even within autistic people, like I like it super quiet and super bright. So there's someone who would want it super quiet and dim lights, and someone who would want a little bit music and, the medium lighting. But so I'm super generalizing. So let's focus on people who process more intensely, because even for practicality's sake, if you're understimulated, adding stimulation is not that difficult. Just give someone, a little music in their headphones, so let them jump around. And however, if in the entire environment is overstimulating and someone gets into it, their entire day is going to be ruined. Because if like I get hit with loud music like for 3 minutes early in the morning, I'm useless for the rest of the day. So it's just the practicality. Right now, it's the opposite. We're going to make it noisy and we're going to give you headphones. Not the best idea, really, for inclusive workplaces. And trying to make this create lower stimulation environments and allowing people who are sensory seeking bring in their own style of stimulation. And it could be whatever. It could be a bright item on their desk, or it could be whatever they want to listen to in the headphones, as long as not everyone is subject to the same music, like, whatever works for your brain. But right now, we're just doing the opposite thing. Someone decides that they're going to play, whatever for everybody, and there's just no choices and no options and no flexibility. If somebody decides to create, bright red wall or something else because you need a punch of color, and then people are like, I have a migraine from this. So something that is more neutral as a baseline with opportunities to punch it up as needed might make the most sense, in that it's going to be accommodating for the most people, and especially for sensory sensitive autistics. And it could be smells too. To me, it's hearing. And just noise is just not my friend. Lighting is a little bit less of annoying, even so I do hear the buzz of fluorescent lights. But again, it's more hearing than even just like, the light doesn't make me happy. But some people are super sensitive. They literally get migraines from the light that they can't adjust. Some people are super sensitive to smell. So all of those things need to be considered: smells, textures, every aspect of physical environment, but you want adjustability. And things like a bright red wall are really hard to tone down.
Yeah, and I love this idea of, instead of making the accommodation or the change to tone things down, we start at a lower bar and then people can punch it up. I think that is like a wonderful takeaway and a really great way that we can think about this. And I also appreciate the nuance of sensory profiles and how different and conflicting they can be even within the same person. I have a child who has autism and ADHD, and those are interesting combinations, because I think one is there's sensory sensitivity, and on the other hand, there's a craving for constant stimulation. And the two are kind of always at war with each other. And the net result is very, different needs and different hours of the day, even. And so I appreciate that it's starting from that baseline, thinking about just designing spaces or giving people access to spaces that are lower on the sensory end, and then people can tend to their own needs as they need to. Again, it's also like a great argument for work from home, isn't it?
Exactly. That would be the next thing I was going to say, because you can't really create a workplace that 100% works for everybody. But if you just do hybrid or work from home, that solves so many problems.
Yeah. I want to shift the conversation a little bit based on something that I keep hearing a lot from leaders, and this is how to manage performance and productivity in neurodiverse teams. So it's hardwired into a lot of businesses, that we should be trying to extract maximum value from each employee, and there's performance and productivity pressure all the way up the chain of management and into the higher echelons. Does neuroinclusion mean lowering that bar?
I don't think extraction and high bar are the same thing. I would argue that if instead of extracting, we're facilitating or inspiring higher productivity, we probably will have higher productivity because you can only beat out so much out of people. You can inspire and facilitate a lot more and much more sustainably. So I think there also needs to be a mind shift that we're not just pushing people, because pushing actually is really not the best way to treat the sentient being of any kind, but you really want to match people best with their jobs and let them do what they enjoy. And when it comes to autistic people and some ADHDers, you might actually need to stop them from working themselves too much because they go into hyperfocus if you just let them do what they enjoy. And you will get so much more out of people being in hyperfocus and focusing on outcomes rather than how long they're sitting in the office.
Yep.
And going just starting from the joy of work and restoring the joy of work to people. And you will not need to be beating them or extracting something out of them or squeezing out of them, because that also doesn't make sense. People need to rest. If they do more work and then they have ability to recover from, it's not sustainable. And people say, oh, we'll just throw them out and hire fresh ones. And where exactly are you going to get fresh ones if everyone is doing that? And that's my literal conversation with the CFO at one point. Just wasn't getting it. And squeezing people to death, this doesn't make sense. You need to think about human sustainability, and that the best work comes from people who are rested and inspired.
Yeah, I love this idea too of not really managing how long somebody's sitting at their desk, but rather, overall the output and the impact of their work. A friend of mine who's in HR said to me last week, she said, we don't manage time, we manage energy. And that's like a different way of thinking about what your focus is. So if somebody does need to take a break and go for a walk, they're managing their energy. And that's way more important than them being tethered to a workplace and being unproductive.
Makes a lot more sense.
Yeah. And could you talk a little bit about, the metaphor that you've used in your book about the canary? When I picked up your book, I was familiar already with the expression of the canary in the coal mine, but I'm not sure that everybody is. So would you mind just explaining that metaphor and how it applies to neuroinclusion?
Sure. Canaries in coal mines are a historical fact. And in the UK, for much of the 20th century, every mine was required to employ 2 canaries, and they were used to detect toxic gases in shafts, because by design, canaries process oxygen much more intensely, process air more intensely on inhale and on exhale. And that also means they are more sensitive to the toxins. It allows them, to fly and to do all the bird things, but it also means that they're just more impacted and impacted faster. So when people would see that canary is not doing well, they would evacuate, and they actually had tiny oxygen tanks for canaries. So they were actually resuscitated. And the idea is that if you just create air that's healthy for canaries, it's going to be healthy for everyone. So instead of creating those environments where sometimes people, faint and need to be resuscitated, why not create environments where everyone can breathe freely and do their best work and be inspired to do their best work and be matched to the jobs and to have input and to be evaluated by outcomes. There's literally not a human that would be hurt by those things. Evaluation by outcomes, participation, transparency. Everyone benefits from characteristics of the workplace that is beneficial for neurodivergent people. So it's just something that could allow us create better workplaces for everyone. And dignity-focused work also is something that benefits everyone.
Yeah, I thought that was so striking, and the way that you carried it through your whole book was really beautiful. It was such an inspiring read. So I do want to ask you, aside from this canary metaphor, what is the key message that you hope leaders will take away from your book?
Well, caring leadership and human-focused and dignity-focused workplaces benefit everyone. And if you just again remember just one thing, that diversity is not a deficit, that solves so many problems.
Of course. And thank you for bringing it all so simply. I want to just say the book is full of these sort of simple truths, but you also provide such extensive detail and examples. So I do encourage people to take a look. This book for me was the manual on this subject. It was the first time that I have found such a comprehensive resource about this subject. So I do want to honestly thank you for this book and highly recommend it to our listeners as well.
Well, thank you. Thank you, Dominique.
You're so welcome. As we close, I just want to ask my favorite bonus question, which is, given that I've just given praise to your book, is there anyone that you would like to praise who has done work in the area of neurodiversity? Anyone you want to point to and amplify?
I have a couple of names. One is Sarah Hendricks. Her work is specifically on autistic women, and she has a book on autistic women, and she also had some YouTube videos, and actually that's what made me, one of the first things that made me think that, maybe, it's not just autistic boys who like trains. So I really like her work, and she's been around for a very long time and has done a lot in this area. And another person is Eric Garcia, who also has a book about autism and accepting his own differences. He's a journalist, and he does a lot of really good work bringing those hard questions about misinterpretations of what autism is to the national attention, just using his journalistic background.
Amazing. Thank you so much for those recommendations. I will definitely check them out. Dr. Ludmila Praslova, thank you so much for your book and for your presence here today. It means a lot to me to be able to bring this conversation to our listeners and hopefully to build a more neuroinclusive future.
My pleasure. Thank you so much for having me, and I appreciate all the great work you do.
Thank you so much. And listeners, if you're curious about this topic and Ludmila's work, please follow the links in the show notes to follow her on LinkedIn and to grab a copy of her book, The Canary Code, A Guide to Neurodiversity, Dignity, and Intersectional Belonging at Work, which, as you've gathered, I honestly cannot recommend highly enough. It is the book on neuroinclusive workplaces. I'll also drop a link to Oakbridge Academy, which I did mention, for anyone who is in the Greater Toronto Area or Kitchener, Waterloo, Cambridge, or Guelph like me. The Oakbridge community has been absolutely life-changing and hugely affirming for my family, so I'm happy to link them as well. And please reach out to me if you'd like to be a featured guest on this podcast or if you'd like to sneakily nominate someone. I love having conversations with learning and development, HR, and DEI professionals who are very passionate about their message, or with people in adjacent fields who have something to teach us in these people and culture and learning roles. And if you like what you're hearing, please leave us a rating and a review or share this episode to your own socials. It truly does help get the podcast into more ears. I'm Dominique. Thank you so much for listening, and see you next time on Just One Q.